I'd ask you to please save the date. Our next webinar will be in late April, and it's going to be on another topic that was of interest to many of the departments that we partner with, as well as Cleveland Noble. That topic is going to be building the next generation of leadership, succession planning for your agency. First of all, some logistics for today. We will be sending a PDF of our presentation, as well as a link for an audio recording of today's webinar. We do that so you will be able to focus on the information and not have to worry about taking notes and other types of things like that. Also, we will be answering questions at the end of the webinar. What I would ask is that you send your questions to me. My name is Larry Borodkin. I'm the Vice President of Safety Forest Services at PRADCO. My email address is on the screen, and that is lborodkin, L, B as in boy, O-R, O, D as in David, K-I-N, at PRADCO, PRADCO.com. So we'll leave that slide up for a minute in case you want to write down the email address from there. I also will give it at the end of the presentation. For now, I would like you to please put your phone on mute. That way, in case there's any noise in the background, we won't be hearing your private conversation. We are really excited about partnering with Noble Cleveland for this webinar series. Noble is the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, and the topics, as I mentioned, that we're presenting, it really came from two areas, one being Noble and the training committee, and we're lucky enough to have the current president of Noble here, who I will introduce in a moment, as well as the departments that we work with. Many issues come up over and over again as we work with our chiefs, so we felt the combination of those two sources would make for a good quarterly webinar series. As I mentioned, I'm Larry Borodkin. I'm Vice President of Safety Services at PRADCO. I lead the Safety Force Business Unit here and have been at PRADCO for 23 years. I'll let my colleague, Caleb Embaugh, say a few words about himself.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Larry. Good morning, everybody. So my name is Caleb Embaugh. I'll be taking us through a lot of the content in the presentation today. Thanks again for joining us. Looking forward to going through this together.
It's really a terrific honor for me to be able to introduce actually more people from the village of Woodmere than I even expected. I'll get to Chief Mason in a moment. But we're also lucky enough to have Lieutenant John Patterson here from Woodmere. So, Lieutenant, if you just wanted to say hi, that would be great.
Hello, everybody.
And now I'd like to introduce Chief Sheila Mason. She's the police chief of the village of Woodmere, president of the Greater Cleveland chapter of Noble. Chief Mason will share a few words with us.
Good morning. My name is Sheila Mason. I'm the Chief of Police of Woodmere. I've been there since 2012. We're a small city village surrounded by orange, pepper, and moreland. I retired from Tri-C Tahoe Community College back in 2009, and I had the opportunity to do various jobs and hold various positions with the college, and it gave me great experience to get to the position where I'm at today as the chief of police. I'm the interim president at the time for Noble, Greater Cleveland chapter. We do a lot of community events, but we are more so here to assist other officers of law enforcement when there are situations that we may be able to come in and mediate or assist with.
the topic of millennials, I didn't know, Chief, if you wanted to share an example now or wait for later, whatever you want to do.
Well, most of our department is millennials. I think I may be the oldest person there. But it's a great experience because they have allowed me to see a different side of law enforcement. So it's just an example. If you all notice, we have a new unit, the K-9 unit, and it's our little puppy. And one of the officers came, and I think Officer Dotson is about 23, and he was like, Chief, we need to change and bring in something new. And so he wanted to do the K-9 unit, so we found a sponsor, and it's up and running, and he is the person that's handling the K-9 unit, and he's excited about it. And look on our site, and you'll see our puppy.
That's great. Thank you, Chief. I just wanted to tell you a little bit briefly about PRADCO, and as you'll see as we just start scrolling this down the page, PRADCO works with over 150 police and fire departments. Leader and safety force assessments from the entry levels that the department does, police, dispatch, corrections, etc., all levels of promotional assessment. Of course, as it should be with any selection process, all the tools are validated, and we've helped many departments develop a multi-step selection process to ensure that their systems are cost-effective. Finally, more and more, our chiefs are asking us to work with command staff in doing one-on-one coaching to help with making leaders even stronger. So with that, I'd like to hand things over to Mr. Embaugh for the main presentation.
Thank you very much, Larry. So, yeah, as we all know, we're here today to talk about millennials, and there's kind of three primary objectives that we'd like to accomplish with you today. So the first is to maybe provide some new knowledge and insight into kind of millennials in general, the tendencies that they may show. Oftentimes, I think if you ask somebody, what does it mean to be a millennial, you'll probably come up with one or two things pretty quick. They're probably not going to be positive things. The words entitled or lazy may come to mind. But there's obviously a lot more to it than those items. So we're going to try and shed a little bit of light on that. In addition to that, what we want to do is then use that additional knowledge, right? So we want to take that knowledge and use it to get a little bit of perspective because, regardless of who you're leading or what organization you're in, the better you can understand the perspective of that person that you are trying to manage or that you are trying to lead, the better equipped you're going to be successful with them. And then finally, right, we want to know, okay, so what can we do then to get these better results? And so what we have are, from our perspective and the research that we've done and the clients that we have worked with, areas that you can focus in to get some of those better results and start to pay attention to get the most out of that generation of employees. So I want to kick us off with a quote that I thought was pretty appropriate for today's topic. So the quote is, "Management is about human beings. Its task is to make people capable of joint performance, to make their strengths effective and their weaknesses irrelevant." The quote's from a guy named Peter Drucker. He's sort of one of the founding fathers of really studying management and what it means to be a really good leader. And what I really like about this quote is that it's results-oriented, right? At the end of the day, it's about how you're going to get the most out of that person. So it's not to make their strengths effective and brute force their weaknesses into no longer existing. It's into how to leverage that person the best way that you can to get the most out of them for your organization. So what do we want to know about millennials? Step one is going to be just who are they? As you think about who that is, oftentimes at this point, millennial can be shorthand for young employee, which was accurate for a long time, but as we'll find, may not be quite as accurate anymore. We also want to know, what do they know and what do they do? So what knowledge base are they operating from? What has kind of the general experience been for that generation? And what do they do? How do they spend their time? What are their tendencies? Because, of course, as we know more about that, we can more effectively manage. And then finally, and potentially most importantly, what are their priorities? My personal opinion is that when you really understand somebody's priorities is when you are really best equipped to manage them in an effective way. If you know what somebody's priorities are, you can shape your feedback to be effective. You can shape your performance goals to be effective. And so those will be things that we touch on as well. So our first topic, who are millennials? Millennials include anybody born between the years 1981 and 1996. And it's kind of weird to think about, but that's actually quite some time that has passed now. In 2019, millennials include anybody from 23 all the way up to 38. So it is no longer necessarily just the young employees that are coming into the organization. In fact, millennials now account for the largest proportion of the workforce. By next year, it's predicted that they'll be just under half of the total workforce. So millennials are really kind of no longer the incoming generation. They're actually sort of just the workforce now. The incoming generation is going to be Generation Z, which that's going to be a different topic and a different conversation. But that generation started in '97, meaning the oldest members are 22 years old and just starting to hit the workforce. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't take a moment to say we cannot use a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to interacting with millennials. So there are trends, absolutely. There are things that in general we can kind of look out for because oftentimes they tend to be true. But if you've got somebody in your organization who doesn't fit this, that doesn't mean you don't want to try and force them into that model. There will be individual differences that may not line up exactly. So it's our responsibility as managers to be reactive and responsive to that. So that's who millennials are. What do they know? So first off, they know the reputation that they have. There's a lot between media and all other different kinds of sources. And so it's not a secret to millennials what a lot of the perspective is from other generations. In fact, when surveyed about, is my work reputation important to me? Do I spend a lot of time thinking about my work reputation? Millennials endorsed those items. They picked that and said that about themselves at twice the rate that baby boomers did. So it's something that is really sort of top of mind for that generation. I also think that one of the reputations that a millennial may have is sort of being glued to their phone or social media and having that be a really high priority for them, potentially too high of a priority. For whatever it's worth, when actually kind of measured and surveyed out, baby boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials actually all landed pretty much in the same. So when asked, is my social media reputation most important to me, 2% of millennials said yes, 1% of Gen Xers said yes, and 3% of baby boomers said yes. So there's potentially more consistency there than you may have guessed. Millennials also know that they want to make a difference, and this is an advantage, I think, for safety forces because you provide an opportunity for employment that really taps directly into this in ways that other organizations do not. And so at the end of the day, oftentimes millennials want to make sure that what they're doing is having some sort of kind of positive social impact. 86% of millennials report to making charitable contributions. At the end of the day, they want to know that they are improving things and hopefully leaving things a little bit better than they found them. Technically speaking, millennials know more than any generation before them. They are the best educated generation in history, and they represent an 18% increase in four-year degrees over baby boomers, for example. So this is a generation that is really focused on learning and development, and we'll talk about that more, and a lot of that starts here. And as I mentioned, that focus on learning and development, what do they know? Oftentimes it seems like never enough. That constant ask for development, that constant ask for feedback, and it is certainly a legitimate element of that generation where there is a lot of requests for those feedback and that constant learning. And again, we'll provide some strategies and talk around that, but that drive is absolutely there. So what do millennials do? One, they collaborate. At the end of the day, this is one of the things that is consistently rated as most important to millennials is being in an environment where they can collaborate. Now, we say that fully recognizing the challenges that can come with that in a paramilitary environment, right? That it's not always the right thing to everybody sit down in a circle and talk about what the right decision is. You know, if you're on scene and you need to make decisions, or there's just simply chain of command that needs to be followed, of course we need to be responsive to that. But at the end of the day, when you do have the opportunity to be a little bit more collaborative, to bring those individuals in to be part of the conversation, not that it has to go their way, but just to be heard, that is often going to really engage that group. Something else millennials do is leverage technology really well. So this is a resource that oftentimes I think might be a little underutilized if you were looking at new technology solutions or looking for folks who are, going to be able to pick those things up pretty quickly. Oftentimes this is going to be your best bet. Then what do? What they want, when they want, or at least a lot of times it feels that way, right? It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but one of the things that we hear a lot from millennials is that they would like flexibility in their role, and a lot of flexibility in the role. And again, we recognize that, for a safety forces organization, it's not always easy to provide that flexibility. You have to have coverage, you have to have a certain amount of people on shift, you can't just let people work from home today. And so because of that, we recognize there are challenges there. We do have some potential solutions for you, or at least some strategies that we have seen be successful with other organizations, but that flexibility is definitely a point of emphasis. And then finally, a focus on employability versus job security. So what do I mean by this? Oftentimes what we'll find is that, in the past it may have been, I'm going to start at an organization, I will work there for 30 years, I will get my retirement watch, and that will be my relationship with my organization. That model, though, at least from the millennial perspective, has not necessarily been so successful. And so what I mean by that is that this is the generation that grew up through the Great Recession. And so 1 in 5 individuals of this generation was directly, significantly impacted by the Great Recession, meaning either it was you and your family or somebody that you knew that went through some pretty significant hardship through that time. And they saw people who had been in a role for 30 years get laid off, not have transferable job skills, and be sort of up a creek. And so because of that, there has been this shift to, I want to make sure that I am building skills that make me effective and make me valuable, not only necessarily within my organization, but also in general. So the next item on our list was priorities. We wanted to talk and understand priorities. And so I've got a nice table here that I want to share with you from North Coast 99 from a couple of years ago. So this is actually specific to Northeast Ohio, although we see these same trends nationally. And I want to give you kind of just a minute to look at that. I know we've got a lot of information on the screen, so I'll pause for just a second for you to review. So as you can see, we do have transitions all the way back to the traditionalists up to the millennial generation. We do have changes and shifts that happen year to year. But if you're anything like me, your eye may have been drawn to a fairly particular part of this chart, which is that top priority. So for about 50 years straight, we had this same top priority of having challenging and meaningful work through the traditionalists, baby boomers, Gen Xers, and then millennials came in, and it was compensation. And initially, my gut reaction is that feels a little shallow, right? Everybody else was looking at meaningful work, wanting to be challenged, and now we have this shift to compensation. And so when we talked earlier a little bit about perspective, this is one area where I thought we might be able to share some of that. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit about what the economic reality is for most millennials. And what that is that just about everything is more expensive than it was in the past. And that's not just due to inflation, but, to buy the same house or buy the same car, you're generally paying significantly more. So I want to share just a couple of figures with you. For Gen X, compared to millennials, for your average housing, so again, this is nationally across the country, for your average housing, a Gen Xer was going to pay around $100 grand, where a millennial is up to about $170K now for that same house. for rent. So it's like, okay, well, you know, maybe there are tougher restrictions and regulations and building has become more expensive. Maybe I can rent instead. Unfortunately, rent has increased a bit as well. So again, nationally, what your average Gen Xer might pay for rent compared to what your average millennial is going to pay has increased fairly substantially. And then lastly, college. So a Gen Xer's annual college cost was usually around $3,200, you know, on average. For a millennial, it's around 10 grand. And so you can start to see this picture that gets put together where, you know, it can be tough to sort of dig out of that hole and kind of launch life and get started. And so you may imagine everything that we've talked about, you know, the Great Recession that happened, and then with things being more expensive just sort of in general, and having to be really careful with discretionary spending, that millennials have been very careful with the way that they spend their money. And it's kind of interesting because, you know, if you sort of took that example in a vacuum and you said, I have a group of people here, they saw a group ahead of them go through some hard times, go through that recession, and they recognized that they needed to make really smart, deliberate decisions about the way that they were going to spend their money, and they're going to be pretty picky about that. You know, I think that gets looked at as those would be good, sound financial decisions. You know, that would be something that you respect. But going to back to that reputation, and sometimes I think a tendency to sort of pile on a little bit, that's not necessarily what the headlines are going to say. The headline is going to say a psychologically scarred millennial is killing countless industries because they don't like them. And, you know, and that grabs page views and that gets people's attention. And they even say, you can see down there in the first paragraph, there are many complex reasons, including less financial stability, memories of growing up in a recession. But that's not the way that the message is delivered. The message is delivered that these are psychologically scarred people who are not spending money just because they don't like things. So that can be sometimes a little bit of a difference between what I would say is the perception versus the reality for that experience. All of that to say, I am in no way stating that there are no sort of challenges with the generation, right? Whether it be about feedback or wanting to move up quickly, and different angles of the way that you want to interact with them as a manager that may be more difficult than other generations. But again, I do think that this provides some good perspective. So now hopefully you're feeling like you're a little bit more informed and you've got a little bit more of that knowledge base for millennials. For us, in terms of interacting with them successfully, there are really kind of 4 primary areas that come out for us to focus on. So we're going to talk about each of these individually, give you some of those strategies before we wrap up for some question and answer. So the first piece, flexibility, this is the toughest element for safety forces organizations, at least generally. And again, we recognize that there are challenges with being able to implement flexibility into your organization and into the structure. That said, where we have seen success with some agencies is looking at, one, how shifts are adjusted and done. So, for example, oftentimes if an organization goes to 12-hour shifts, that millennial is going to get more days off, and that is oftentimes interpreted as having more flexibility. I kind of have potentially, at least it feels like, more time to do things, and you're going to get some of that credit for that. Another option is leveraging overtime and side jobs. So if somebody wants to have the ability to work a weekend or work an evening to make some extra money, this can very much be framed up as an opportunity to be flexible to that and to them, and that's something that they can control and kind of drive, which oftentimes gets a very good response. Finally, with the flexibility element, if you have time, you can sit down and explain the why. And I know oftentimes this is sort of one of the frustrations that comes from dealing with the millennial generation. But again, if we're being results-oriented and what we really care about and what we really prioritize is getting the most out of this group, this is one of the ways that you're going to do it. So if you can take a moment to just sort of walk through the reality of not being able to implement necessarily all those flex policies because of the requirements of the job, generally you're going to get buy-in much more quickly. The second element, technology, this is something that, you know, you want to put those hours of practice to good use. This is an organization that grew up with, or I'm sorry, a generation that grew up with cell phones in their hand. The first iPhone came out in 2007, and so at that point, the youngest millennial was 11 years old. And so what that means is that they have grown up with this. So use that, because oftentimes they can be successful with technology that may not be intuitive to others, but can be really intuitive there. Another resource that I often think is untapped is to ask their opinion, ask for solutions. When it comes to technology, we found with a lot of the different departments and organizations that we work with that you might not know what you don't know, and there might be solutions that you are able to implement and bring to somebody that they're going to like and be very useful and engaging for that individual. And what I mean by that is to make that focus on technology a selling point. Law enforcement and safety forces have the opportunities to work with a lot of really cool technology, you know, and there are, again, those solutions that we talked about. There are RFID scanners that do inventory where all you need to do is walk into a room and walk out, and that item is checked in or checked out. There's cloud-based scheduling specifically for law enforcement where it's all done through the internet and anybody can check and change their schedule from anywhere with an internet connection. So the more that you can use these things, the more that you're going to drive engagement with that group. And then finally, personal development. So feedback is crucial, right? And this is an area where I think we get a lot of folks that can be frustrated, and I think that this is one of the legitimate concerns in dealing with the millennial generation is that feedback can be a tough conversation. Oftentimes they have to feel good about the way that that feedback comes across in order for it to really hit home and to be implemented, or for them to not get frustrated. So again, I would encourage you not to get too hung up on the principle of the matter, because while I understand that, if you're going to be results-oriented and your top priority is getting that best performance out of that person, taking a minute to slow down a little bit and implement that feedback in a way that they're going to respond positively is going to gain you a lot. Adding technical skills, so there are no shortages of specialties and certifications and trainings that people can be sent to within these roles. And so this is a very clear, obvious way that you can kind of send the message to that individual that we are investing in you and that we want to help you to develop. Now, I say that, of course, knowing, well, great, if I had all the resources in the world and I could send everybody to every training that they wanted to go to, then I would do that. So certainly I understand that it has to be looked at within that context, and hopefully one thing that you might consider, if that's an element you're running into, is that you can also cross-train, and we've seen a lot of success here where oftentimes there is someone within a department who is the best at what they do. They are the expert at that thing. And so what you can do is work with them to do some internal training where they can share some of that expertise with other people. And that can be within the department or that could be across departments. We've seen several departments work together to collaborate for these kinds of trainings. And that's a way that you can provide some of this development that they are craving without necessarily having to spend all of those resources to accomplish it. Then we have meaningful work. So for meaningful work, again, I think Safety Forces is well positioned to take advantage of this. The impact that you guys have on people, on communities, on organizations is huge and is very clear and is very obvious compared to maybe other roles or other positions. So this is something that I would really leverage, that I would bring front and center, and make sure also that you're keeping in front of people. One thing that I will mention with this is to keep the job preview realistic, right? So, if they're thinking that they're going to wipe out crime in the city in the next 3 years, we probably want to bring that down a little bit. But what we see a lot of value in oftentimes is having maybe a more veteran officer sit down and talk them through a really big impact that they had on one of the citizens in their community, or a really big impact that they had through a project within a community and things like that. So, you want to keep it realistic, but you also want to show them that impact that can be had on a one-on-one or more specific level. And then finally, don't forget about your more experienced employees. Once you're in the job for a number of years, it can start to just become normal, and you sort of don't really realize or think about the impact that you're having on people. And when that's the case, you can lose some of that and the engagement that would come from some of that. So don't forget about those individuals. Make sure that you are still reminding them and showing them how you are helping them or how they are helping the community and how they are making a big impact. At the end of the day, millennials being criticized is nothing new. In fact, every generation is criticized. So baby boomers were actually considered a generation that was reluctant to grow up. And Generation X were characterized as a generation that complained too much. And I want to read just very briefly some snippets from newspaper articles from those times to kind of give you guys a flavor of how people felt about that. So the first is going to be an article from the New York Times, and it's about the baby boomers, and the name of the article is The Non-Savers. So it says, the parents of baby boomers, the last generation to save, are now in peril of losing their jobs as companies cut back, merge, or disappear. The 60s generation was not into saving. They were not even into working. Their children, our present yuppies, that would be Generation X, had no role models, and besides, when a 25-year-old can come out of law or business school and command a salary his grandparents never dreamed of, what incentive is there? So pretty strong words for the baby boomers. Then the next article, this is going to be about Generation X. This is a Newsweek article, and it was labeled the whiny generation. And so this article says, well, enough is enough. As a baby boomer, I'm fed up with the ceaseless carping of a handful of spoiled, self-indulgent, overgrown adolescents. Generation Xers may like to call themselves the why me generation, but they should be called the whiny generation. If these purveyors of pseudo-angst would put as much effort into getting a life as they do into writing about their horrible fate, we'd all be spared the weekly diatribes that pass for reasoned argument in newspapers and magazines. So those are pretty strong words, right? And I think that that's some good perspective to keep in mind, is that it's just our tendency to kind of really hone in on what we identify as negative elements for a generation. But I don't think that's where the value is. I think for us, the best value is figuring out, okay, there may be these elements that we have to deal with, but how are we going to respond to that, and how can we leverage this knowledge that we know about this generation to make them as effective as possible?
Thank you very much, Mr. Embaugh, for the presentation. I know there's a lot of information there, and just to remind everybody on the webinar that we will be sending out a PDF copy of the presentation to all participants, as well as an audio recording of the presentation as well. Up to this point, we've received a half dozen questions so far. But again, if you would like to email a question to me, my email address is on that slide, lborodkin, L, B as in boy, O-R, O, D as in David, K-I-N, at PRADCO, P-R-A-D-C-O.com. So, first of the questions that we have so far. Person asked, millennials ask why a lot. How long will that last?
Good question. Maybe not the answer you're hoping for. It's probably not going to go away anytime soon. You know, as you think about the collaborative nature that millennials want to be involved, as you think about the developmental nature where they want to kind of know what's going on and where the performance could have been better, generally, a lot of that requires more big picture knowledge. So there is a thirst to understand kind of the why behind it. Oftentimes, I do think that gets interpreted as just being questioned. You know, you're just asking why because you don't want to do it or because you don't think that I should do it. But I truly believe that, at least in most of the cases, it's coming from wanting to know that bigger picture because they feel it's going to make them more effective in the long run.
Please.
For me, and this is strictly my leadership, anytime that we implement anything, we have a quarterly meeting so that we can explain. I believe that we need to be transparent, so when we get ready to do something, they know exactly why. When we have our meetings, I ask, you know, if you do not understand or whatever it is that you want to know, ask. And we try to answer the question. If we don't know it, we always, I commit that we will get back with you. But I think most of our department, our guys, want to know what we're doing, why we're doing it. So I think as a leader, I should be able to provide that information to them. So when they go out they know why they're doing it and why the change happened.
That's excellent, Chief. And just from some conversations with either FTOs or patrol supervisors, oftentimes people just want to know. Even if they don't necessarily agree with the why, just telling them why or the reasoning is often enough just to satisfy it. Great.
You can't say because I said so anymore?
No. That's not the most motivational thing to do, Lieutenant.
I was told.
Not by Chief Mason. Second one, how do I keep my supervisors from becoming frustrated with the new generation?
That's another good question. I mean, so for me, what I have seen be impactful is providing kind of a lot of the knowledge that we went through today. I think having that perspective can sometimes create a little bit more empathy or at least understanding around, why a millennial might act in a certain way. And it is going to require some patience. The other part that I keep going back to is being results oriented. The more you can encourage that person to see, I recognize that telling them why might be frustrating when it feels like it's every time you ask them to do something, but if you're going to maximize the performance there, that's probably worth it.
Any other thoughts? Okay, we're starting to get questions in now, so beyond the ones we already have.
And again, for us, I meet with the supervisors once a month. And we go over a lot of the concerns that the officers have, and we try to answer those questions. I make myself available. Sometimes I'll pop in, and I know they like, man, why is she here? Because I come in on the weekends, I come in at night, because I want them to know that I'm available. So if I've heard some rumbling or some concern, I want them to be able to acknowledge, for me to acknowledge that I hear you, I understand that there's something that I may need to address, especially if my supervisors have brought it to my attention. So,
it's a really good point. Actually, somebody just popped up. We'll take this one. Question, can you talk about the mixing of generations, how to address strengths of one generation without minimizing the others?
Fantastic question. So I think as you sort of get this knowledge for millennials, this certainly the same would be true for other generations, those tendencies, those preferences. So while we didn't cover this content today, certainly your Gen Xers, your baby boomers, whether it be the preference for what communication is or the way that they want to get feedback or how they're going to find engagement in the role, I think the answer is oftentimes to try to be as versatile as possible, and that's tough as a manager, right? If you've got 3 different generations on your team and you have to be able to flex between those 3 different generations from conversation to conversation, it takes some practice and some intentional effort. But the more I think that you can build that versatility in, I think the better results that you'll get.
And it's kind of interesting, and it kind of goes to that last question, too. Sometimes I know with the supervisors, it's important for them to understand that if someone's asking why, or if there are some of these generational conflicts, it's not anything that the supervisor did, and it's not anything intentional the officer is doing. The point being that you could go to an engineering company or a sales company or a manufacturing company, those generational differences will exist. And the second point is, while some of us may get frustrated by some of that, we really can't label it as right or wrong. It isn't. It's just what is.
Right.
So it's just the basic of dealing with it. Okay. Here's another question popping up all over the place, which is great. When it comes to recruiting, what are the key points to attracting millennials?
So I think, if we go back to that slide that talked about flexibility, technology, meaningful work, being able to implement those things, those are some of the primary areas where you're going to get quote-unquote credit from a millennial for being a progressive organization and for being somewhere that is attractive to them. The other element that I would add to that is the more that you can make it clear that this is part of your culture and not sort of just a set of perks that you have out as a lure, then you know, they're going to recognize that and they're going to be responsive to that. And certainly open to, if you guys have thoughts as well.
Well, mine is social media.
Mm-hmm.
If they see it, they have an idea of what they're coming to. Oh, and they see what's going on in your department. From with us just getting our new dog, people are walking around saying, "Hey, we heard you got a new puppy." You know, all over. And so this generation is more or less Twitter, Facebook. Well, I don't know if they're Facebook, Snapchat, you know, all these other newer things. They're all about that. So if we're into that as well, we're getting our message through that as well. They're responsive to that.
Great. Another, how do you get the leaders of today, such as the baby boomers and Generation X, to accept the ideas of millennials and Gen Y and Gen X?
Mr. Emba, before you start answering, is it possible for everyone to move a little closer to the phone so we can hear all the respondents answering the questions, please?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much.
I'll repeat that question again. How do you get the leaders of today, such as the baby boomers and Gen X, to accept the ideas of millennials, Gen Ys?
Well, hopefully, and you know, part of the idea behind today's conversation was to provide that knowledge that gives some of that perspective where they're not just being difficult for the sake of being difficult, or even if you feel like that's the case, and on principle, you know, I shouldn't have to give feedback in sort of a fluffy way that feels good, or I shouldn't have to be flexible for other people. If you can encourage them to see that, well, okay, you may not feel like you have to, but you know, do you want to get the best from your people? Because if you do, we know this is the way to do that. And generally what I have seen in interacting with command staff is they're results-oriented people, and they do want that. So if you can get over that initial bump of kind of being against it in principle, whether it be by showing them some of that extra perspective or by showing what can be accomplished by pushing through that, oftentimes you can get better buy-in.
Great. How, as we manage millennials, how do we keep from becoming a kind of like a farm league, training people but then having them leave for other agencies? She's just smiling.
At some point, Woodmere used to be a department that no one really interact with. And I can say since 2012 that our role in the law enforcement community has changed. We do a lot of training. We are technology. We welcome all new technology. So for the last 6 years, we kind of have been the training department for a lot of the other cities. And I'm okay with that because that means that we're doing something good and that we're doing something great for our department also, that other departments are looking at our officers to come to their department. Yes, it's a major finance for us, but on the whole, I can say that we have had some good officers go to other departments, and I'm very proud of them, and I never try to hold them back. When the chiefs call and say, you know, I'm looking at your officer, what about, if they're a good officer, I'm going to give them the raise, and they're being very successful at that department. So it's a little hump to get there, but I can say that the ones that are there, they're trained. We are constantly a training facility, and I think in order for us to be successful, we have to have that training going in. So
I think that it has to be expected because we are small, but for the most part, for those people who have left, they have not wanted to leave, only due to financial whatever, or trying to get a full-time position. Something. They didn't leave because we weren't the department they wanted to be at. We just didn't have it. So I think is what we're doing now. Most people want to stay with us.
builds that loyalty.
Yes.
Just in case anybody had any trouble hearing that answer, it was that a lot of the turnover that they have experienced at Woodmere has been around kind of incidental details, you know, whether or not they have to leave for family reasons or other reasons that come into play, whereas those who have the option to really stay and be engaged, they've seen a lot of that.
Yes.
Another question, millennials, and I think this was mentioned in the presentation, millennials have trouble taking feedback. What can I do so they better accept constructive criticism?
Yeah, so if you guys want to jump in, I've got my thoughts. But
Well, I always do with the structure positive, what you did wrong, positive, and kind of go back over again what we're here for.
Right, right.
So,
yeah, so that's a great kind of rule of thumb, the sandwich rule,
yeah.
right? So you're going to give somebody a good piece of feedback around something that they're doing well, give them the piece of feedback around where they need to improve, and then wrap up with, again, ideally on a positive note. And in a lot of cases, that's going to get you a pretty good response. This is an area that I think is probably one of the legitimate complaints about the millennial generation, is that there's a tendency sometimes to be a little bit defensive or to take that feedback maybe a little bit personally. And so that's something that I would encourage you to coach them through, both directly and indirectly. You know, it's not a bad thing to have a conversation to say, hey, when I'm giving you feedback, know that it's coming from a place of wanting to help you and wanting to get you to a better place and to help you to develop. Because as soon as that individual takes that conversation and puts it into the bucket of being developed versus being yelled at, then you're home free. They see that as adding value, and it's going to want to make them stay.
Question? Is there anything to be spoken about in terms of criteria violations for hiring millennials? Not exactly sure what that means. Maybe if the person could rephrase that or resend it. I'm not sure what criteria violations mean. Until that one's sent back.
That person could also choose to unmute their phone and verbally ask the question.
Oh, okay. Thank you. We'll stand by for a minute or so. Well, maybe while that person's thinking about it, we'll just go to the next question we received. What can I do about my millennial officers' use of social media so it does not get them into, or the department into, difficulty?
Great question. Anybody want to jump in before I give my thoughts?
With an incident of such, we had to let them know that what we want to put out there, we want to have control of the narrative as to what's going to be put out as representing the department.
Right.
We do let them know we do check their Facebook or social media or whatever they have, just because we want them to know that, you know, it reflects on us as a department because you're trying to represent us, and we don't know what you're saying, so we'd rather you not use your personal putting stuff out. We try to put as much out as we can, meaning the dog, our donations they're raising for breast cancer awareness, to fill the truck, the cruiser for the food banks, and we put it all out there. So there's really not much you need to do in your personal. We try to keep that. That's your personal. That's personal things. Here's the department. We are flooding it with whatever we can with the department. So.
Yes, I think that's a fantastic point. You know, if the department or if the organization is being proactive about having that social media presence, then one, you can make sure that you can control what that message looks like and control if that's going out in a way that you would want it to. And then the other element that I might add to that is just letting people know, you know, there's this, I think, feeling or sense of security, even on my personal account maybe. Well, it's my personal account. I can say whatever I want. And at the end of the day, especially if you're a public servant, you know, you do reflect on potentially a larger population. So, you know, you don't necessarily want to get too into trying to control what people can do on their own social medias. At the same time, we do think it's good to communicate a message of, you know, you're a reflection of us, so please keep that in mind as you know, make those decisions.
And your policy and procedure should also state what you can do and put out there as far as your department.
Right.
So.
Right. Great point.
to the extent that that can be, as you said, to put it out there so everyone is aware of those. And I think also something, and many departments emphasize this with their officers, some don't, that they're really, you're kind of on display all the time. And how you're being seen, whether it's social media or in person at Eden Collection, for example, that's what they think of the department. So a lot of people think there's a separation, but in some jobs, either fortunately or unfortunately, there really isn't. You're always public relations for the police department, whether you're on shift or not. This is going to be a tough one, I think. How can I introduce flexibility when so much is dictated by union contract?
That is a good question.
Yeah. I thought this has come up before, so I'll take a first stab, and if anybody else has. I think a lot of it comes down to how we define flexibility. Certain things with, like hours and schedules and vacation rights, a lot of that is dictated by contract. But maybe there are other types of things, and I think everybody has to be creative. I don't have any great answers for this, where maybe flexibility is a little bit, all right, during your shift, what would you like to concentrate on? Do you want to do this part of the zone and stay over there? Do you want to devote more time to building checks if that's what you like doing? Or if you like running traffic, maybe you can do that during your shift. So it may, from my perspective, it may be trying to vary up the things that the people have to do anyway, that you do have some leeway on. But when it comes to the more what I call procedural or legalistic things, I think it's more, this is an outsider, I feel that's more difficult. So I'd be curious about what you all think.
I think a little bit of the flexibility, and what we do is we try to make sure that when you're doing your contract, it doesn't take away from management's rights.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. We try to make sure that we still have the ability to do what we need to do while working with you to a point. We're not trying to take it so that you can go and take a 10-minute nap or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
We want to make sure that you're out there being productive, and if it's counter to what we're trying to do in the department overall, we just have to work with trying to iron that out. So.
And we have had, since I've been there, 2012, I can say that our relationship with the union has changed, and we tried to work it out. So whenever we have had a problem, we have met with them and tried to be flexible on both ends. And as so far, it's been working pretty good. And I think it has to be flexibility on both ends as to what you do and how you do it. And then whatever's in writing, you may have to, come back to it later on.
Right.
On the whole, I think it's the more flexibility that I have found.
Great. Well, I think that actually is all of the questions we have at this point. So really want to extend our sincere thanks to the Lieutenant and to Chief Mason and to Mr. Embaugh for the presentation. And just in conclusion, thanks to you all for participating. As I said, PDF will be coming your way, a link to the audio recording, and please be on the lookout for information on our next webinar, which will be at the end of April, topic of succession planning in your agency. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.